Welcome into the Fantasy Football Forge. My name is Steve, and it is time for class, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be looking at the Houston Texans receiving core because I made a comment and then I kind of walked back on it just a sentence or two later regarding this trio of receivers and the expectations and I did all that, by the way, earlier this week, I believe in Monday's video, quarterback wide receiver stacks. So if you didn't catch that series, looked at stacks this week, looked at like all of them, wide receiver, quarterback, tight end, quarterback. I did not look at quarterback, running back, I don't think, but wide receiver, tight end, and wide receiver, running back. So check those out if you haven't seen them. The question of this series is are these guys worth where they're getting taken? So Nico Collins is being taken as the wide receiver 13 off the board. Is he worth it? Stefon Diggs being taken wide receiver 21 off the board, and Dell taking wide receiver 26 off the board. All of them essentially from the top to the bottom of wide receiver twos. Can they all produce within this Houston offense? I don't know. I do know the answer, but you'll have to wait till the end. CJ Stroud, Houston, average pass attempts per game. Well, what I came to was 33.5 pass attempts per game. Very close to both of those numbers. CJ Stroud's average pass attempts per game and the Houston Texans' average pass attempts per game. Then when we look at we need to do a lot for figuring out these target shares. Quite a bit. So we'll look at the 2023 Houston offense first of all, and I broke this down quite a bit granularly to look at the 9 to 12 game sample size where Tank Dell was healthy and played for this team. I say 9 to 12 because there's Nico Collins missed a game in there. There was a lot of little tinkering that I did to come up with these numbers. Now, they're not a whole lot different than the season-long numbers anyways, but I did break it down quite a bit, just a heads up. So when we looked at Nico Collins numbers, and also all of these are rough averages here. As you can see, they're all very clean numbers. So Nico Collins, about 7.5 targets per game, came to about 22% target share. You can see a bunch of right in that area. Tank Dell averaged like 7 targets per game, 21% target share, although Tank Dell produced in a different way. If you look at his season last year, he had a higher ceiling and a lower floor. Some games he only had like 3 receptions, whereas Nico Collins' floor was like 4. But Nico Collins might have only hit that floor once as well, where Tank Dell has like a 3 reception game or target game, and then 2 4-target games, that kind of thing. So to the opposite effect, though, Tank Dell also had games with more targets per game than Nico had all in his entire season. So another fun fact here to look at, and also a tip to the cap of the possible value hat of taking Tank Dell is that if you look at the final 4 games before Tank Dell got injured for the rest of the season, he started to average 11 targets per game. Now, what I will say, and the only reason I kept that in here is because that might get quoted by somebody else. I'm sure somebody else out there will quote that number. That also includes a game where Nico Collins was out for one of those. So 25% of those games, Nico Collins was out. And guess what happened? Tank Dell got 14 targets in that game, the most that he got all season long by like probably 3 targets. You look at the other 3 games while Nico Collins was also healthy, and he averaged 9.5 targets per game. But you might notice something. That's still higher than what Nico Collins was getting. So 3 out of those final 4 games when this offense was running on all cylinders, Tank Dell was out-targeting Nico Collins. Very small sample size, but he was a rookie, so, he could have been progressing, and that might have become the norm by the end of the year. He was on his way to having one heck of a rookie season. Then when we look at the wide receiver 3, this is mostly Robert Woods, a little bit of Noah Brown. They average 7 targets per game. Once again, we're in that number. Tight end, you'll see also right at that 7-target number. Really, CJ Stroud did a great job, and this offensive play calling and everything, they did a great job of getting that ball out and spread amongst all of their targets. And I do expect that to continue to an extent. I don't expect anyone to just completely take over here. In terms of the other wide receivers, there are about another 1.5 targets or 4% target share, and then running backs 4 targets there, about 12%. So when we look at this by position, the average wide receiver target share was about 68% of targets per game. Tight ends accounted for about 20% of the targets per game, and running backs accounted for about 12% of the target share per game. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to shave off a little off of that tight end target share, just given the increase in talent that it brought into this wide receiver room. They were obviously already happy to throw it and chuck it to these wide receivers plenty. And that gives the wide receivers a 70% total. So that is the number that I am trying to get this new wide receiver room locked into, is about 70% of the target share. And I say it's a new room because there are some new additions. However, there are no losses in this wide receiver. I'm assuming they might have to cut a big name, maybe Robert Woods. Maybe not, because he's very familiar with this offense, this coaching staff offensively. But no losses in that room, but they did add Ben Skoranek, another guy coming from the Los Angeles Rams. You might realize not only Robert Woods now from there. And this could signal a plan for a formation that they may want to run in this offense. Possibly a move tight end, fullback-y, big slot receiver type of role, which is exactly the type of role that we saw him used in Los Angeles. It's the good thing about it for us here for this purpose is, as you can see from his role in LA, 2.2%, it's not something that we're expecting him to get a lot of targets with. It's more so that he'll, every now and then they'll surprise target him, but a lot of times he'll be trying to spring guys like Stefon Diggs loose on a screen pass by giving them some excellent blocking, those types of things. But it's just a unique element that Ben Skoranek could bring to this offense, and that does account for a little bit of this target share. We keep that in mind. And then Stefon Diggs averaged 29.5% target share last year. So obviously that's going to create a problem when you think of the other target shares here, and you add all these existing target shares up that we are expecting, and that comes to a surplus of 8.5%, too much. We want that 70% number. So we need to do a little bit of work. First, we need to think philosophically, what are they going to do? So I already have that Ben Skoranek accounting for him similarly to how the Los Angeles Rams used him last year. In terms of Nico Collins, I expect that to stay the same. You will see from like the reception numbers and everything, he and CJ Stroud in this role together fit very nicely, had an excellent connection. And because of Stefon Diggs, I'm not really expecting that role to grow, but I am still expecting him to be able to maintain essentially what he did last year, to certain extents, maybe in a better offense, maybe more, that's something else to keep in mind. Maybe they throw a little bit more this year than last year just because of the weapons that they have. That could help all of these guys a little bit from the projections that we're doing, but luckily that helps to keep us conservative, if anything, at these numbers that we're looking at. Now, Stefon Diggs may be relied, I think, will be relied upon as the high reception, low ADOT, third down and 6. Who are you going to trust? Stefon Diggs, that kind of role. So now this is, I'm thinking philosophically coming in. I haven't seen all the numbers yet. Am I going to lower the ADOT or not? We'll see. Do I increase? He already had a 30% target share, so obviously I'm not increasing the target share. And then we come to Tank Dell, not Tank Dells, and he becomes more volatile, I believe. I think a higher ADOT, lower reception total is something that could make sense. Once again, we'll see if I change some of those numbers or not, because here we are. We're going to look at the adjusted target shares for 2024 with this new staff. Stefon Diggs, we take that 29.5%. That's going to slash that a decent amount down to 24.5%. But like I said, I still expect him to be the highest target getter in this offense. Quite, possibly. Maybe I'm wrong. But in this instance, that brought us to 24.5%. Tank Dell, did expect him to get utilized just a little bit less, a little bit more of a pop kind of guy with the addition of Stefon Diggs there. So 19% target share, down a little bit from last year. Nico Collins, I ended up having to just take a little bit off of his target share, 21%. Took a little bit off of these extra wide receivers, but they're gonna like these guys. In every offense, there's a couple of wide receivers a game that they just get utilized in certain situations and play calls and whatnot. So that's not going to totally disappear. I can't just give this 4% to these other 3 guys. It's not going to only be them in this offense. So took a little bit off of there, kept that Ben Skoranek 2%, and That gets us to 70%. Now, we need a couple of other numbers. We need to know how many balls they're catching. So we're going to look at the catch rate, the reception total. Stroud, on average, his completion percentage was 63.9%. But believe it or not, that's going to change depending on who he's throwing it to. And usually, the further down the field the pass is, believe it or not, the less likely it is to be caught compared to something that's really close to the line of scrimmage is typically how it's going to work out. So, Stefon Diggs last year caught 73% of his targets. That's a very, very good number. But he's going to be in a new role and a new offense this year. And last year in this role, Robert Woods only caught a little over 50% of his targets. And that was with a 3% drop rate. So it's not like he was dropping them all. I don't know if CJ Stroud struggles a little bit getting the ball into the Robert Woods types of, routes. If they just didn't have a strong connection. I'm not exactly sure. I am going to bank a little bit on the fact that Stefon Diggs is just a better receiver than Robert Woods. I ended up with this 68.7% completion number. So we took the 24.5% target rate, multiply that by the number of targets, that 33.5 number. That gives us to 8.2 targets. And then we multiply that by our expected number of targets that they'll catch. So 68.7% gets us to 5.6 receptions. You'll see they're underlined. And for Tank Dell, we do the similar process with all the numbers that we've gathered. Catches 62.7% of his balls last season. We'll use that number again. It's our best number that we've got. That comes to 4 receptions a game. And for Nico Collins, he caught a lot, 73.4%. Very interesting, very similar ADOT to Robert Woods, but a completely different reception total. So Nico Collins, really good reception total there. 5.1 receptions is what that ends up working out to. If they can maintain that. I didn't lower it. Maybe I should have, just to be a little bit conservative with that number. But I think that just shows you, once again, just how nice that connection was last year, and you would think would continue to grow. Now, we need to know what kind of yardage these guys are getting. First number we're going to use is the ADOT. Stefon Diggs averaged 10.3 yards. Average depth of target, by the way, ADOT. 10.3 yards per target. And I said that we would lower that number. Now, if we look at Robert Woods' number, it's 9.8. Usually, the guys working out of the slots on teams will have a lower ADOT than either of these numbers. That 9.8 is pretty high. So I leaned into not lowering too much. Stefon Diggs, 10.3. I ended up with 10 yards per target. So hopefully, if anything, that's a little bit conservative and not aggressive. Then for Tank Dell, he averaged 14.3 average yards, average depth of target last year. I was thinking of going higher with that number after lowering the, average targets per game, but that's a pretty high number. So yeah, maybe it goes up a little bit, but maybe it doesn't. That's a good solid number, especially at the reception catch rate that they had together. And then for Nico Collins, 10.9 average yards per game last year. We're going to keep that the same, just as we have pretty much been doing for Nico with everything. So we take our ADOT, we add in the YAC, and that's going to give us the average yards per reception. So you can see for Stefon Diggs, average 12.2 yards per reception. For Tank Dell, 16.3 yards per reception. And for Nico Collins, 15.9 yards per reception. Look at that big 5 yards after the catch number there. Very nice for his YAC. And we also need to think about the touchdown number. This goes a long ways. So Houston's average touchdowns per game last year, average passing touchdowns or receiving touchdowns, was 1.6 per game. If we were to expect this offense to get better, which we do this year, that number could very well go up, especially once again giving this group, even if the defense is a little bit better and they don't need to score as much, still maybe they get more receiving passing touchdowns than last year. CJ Stroud in his second year, just fewer rushing touchdowns. Also possible. Whatever the case, that's a pretty aggressive number, 1.8. That would have been a top 5 scoring offensive touchdown number last season. Now, the question is, are these guys worth it? So as a reminder, Stefon Diggs, ADP wide receiver 21. You get your 5.6 receptions. That gives us 2.8 fantasy points per game. 5.6 for the times the yard is 68 yards per game is what we should expect. That's 6.8 fantasy points per game. And then this touchdown number, I took the average target percentage in the red zone, because for Stefon Diggs this year, I'm sure they'll take some deep shots with him. And I'm sure out of the 8, whatever, forget the numbers. I'm sure that there would be maybe 1 or 2 touchdowns, maybe none, maybe more. that he'll end up getting from deeper targets, but I think most of his touchdowns will end up coming from within the red zone. So I took that 25% red zone target share number that he had last year, and then I looked at Robert Woods, 17% red zone target share in this offense in that role last year. So I lowered the number there from Stefon Diggs down to 23%, just a little bit lower. That multiply that by our 1.8 touchdowns, that brings us to 0.414 touchdowns per game, which roughly comes to seven touchdowns across the entirety of the season. And last year he had 8. So that number makes sense. I'm thinking 6 to 10 is probably the range that we're looking at. So hopefully a little bit conservative, if nothing else, which brings us to 2.5 fantasy points on average per game we could expect from the touchdown total across the season. Brings us to 12.1 fantasy points, which last year on average, that would have been the wide receiver 19 or 20 on an average per week basis. So he's getting drafted at wide receiver 21. If anything, I do think that he is a little bit of a value at that position, but obviously I'm giving that a thumbs up. I think he's being taken pretty much right on where we're projecting him there. So solid draft spot for Stefon Diggs. And like I said, if anything, I think a little bit of a value. Then Tank Dell, which I talked about a little bit earlier. I think if anything, he is the guy who has the most upside here. He is the guy who we could look back on and say he could be the number one wide receiver out of all three of these guys very easily, and you get him much later. Later than the other two at wide receiver 26. You look at the totals there: 2 points from receptions, about 6.5 points from yardage, and nearly a half a touchdown per game based on his touchdown rate. That's the only number that scares me. 12.1% touchdown rate, pretty darn high, but we take those numbers, that gives us to 11.4 fantasy points, which per game basis, that would have been the wide receiver 25 last year. So he's getting taken as wide receiver 26. It's dead on yet again. And I've already said it. I think he's the guy where the value is truly there for the upside. But that touchdown number, if everything else is correct there, and that number doesn't end up lining up, then he's definitely not going to end up as wide receiver 25, and he's going to be very inconsistent, and you're going to regret it. But I think he's worth the risk either way. Nico Collins kept everything pretty much the same. He's going at wide receiver 20, wide receiver 13. The numbers come out to 13.65 fantasy points per game, which last year, average fantasy points per game would have been the wide receiver 12. So once again, very dead on. I don't think that there's a whole lot more upside to Nico Collins. It's possible. We did see that they have a very good connection, so maybe that does grow further despite Stefon Diggs coming in. Very much possible, but I think he has the least upside given where you're having to draft him. And I do want to point out one thing here. You'll see I have 2 different calculations for the touchdown percentage. I just did it out of curiosity because you might have noticed for Stefon Diggs and for Tank Dell, I did different calculations for those touchdown totals. But when we did them both for Nico Collins here, look at the touchdown rate of 9.9%. So we used the touchdown rate for Tank Dell last year. That brought us to 0.505 touchdowns on average per game and 3 fantasy points. On average, a half of a touchdown per game. Then when I looked at the target percentage in the red zone for Nico Collins, because just like Stefon Diggs, I do expect him to have more, maybe less than Stefon Diggs, a little higher chance of scoring from outside the red zone, but still most of his stuff to come within the red zone, which is why I did the difference. Tank Dell, he's your deep threat. He could have half of his or more touchdowns come from outside the red zone. So that's why I didn't use that number for Tank Dell. But when we use this target in the red zone number for Nico Collins, you across those numbers, it came to 0.504. So 1/1000th, 100,000 millionth? No, 1/10,000th. 1/1000th of a decimal point difference between the two. Ridiculously close either way there. And that is it. Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Stefon Diggs, feel comfortable taking all of them where they are currently going. Peace out.